Hello, and thank you for checking out this talk that I gave back in February of 2023 titled Call the Medica, Women, Magic, and Medicine in Ancient Rome. I have my lovely dog helping me out today. So this talk was given at the Ancient Medicine Seminar at Oxford virtually because no one was flying me out to Oxford at the time. But I figured I'd share it here. So yeah, I'll get started. The paper I'm presenting today is a compilation of two conference papers that were presented at the 2021 and the 2023 AIA annual meetings, which is the Archaeological Institute of America. All right. So anyone who's familiar with my work knows that I am pretty heavily involved with the Gange Vecchio archaeological project. Recent excavation seasons of the Gange Vecchio archaeological project have focused on parcel 19 in the eastern portion of the property. Ground penetrating radar and wide strip excavation of a 10 by 10 meter section have been in use to investigate the top of a mound, which earlier survey work had identified as the area with the highest concentration of Roman artifacts within the property. Excavations over 4 field seasons of 2012, 2015, 2017, and 2019 have revealed a Roman wall, likely of a wealthy Roman villa dating to around the 1st to 4th century CE. Questions about the layout of the structure persist. As you can see, we don't have too much of the wall yet. Here is just a very simple map of what the parcel 19 looks like, and here's the wall itself in this image. So we still have a lot of questions about the layout, but including its relation to possible nearby sanctuary, likely dedicated to a fertility deity of some sort. The artifact count from parcel 19 is extraordinary. This, paired with evidence of structural collapse and burning, as well as burials 7, which is in the profile, in the northern profile, Saggio F, and burial 8, which you can see here, which appear that these were unintentional burials. This argues that some kind of cataclysmic event, such as an earthquake or landslide, resulted in the excellent preservation of the material record at the site. The Roman villa baths at Piazza Armerina, for example, in the nearby region of Enna, were preserved in a very similar manner. And here is just a few examples of the many amazing artifacts we have found at Gange Vecchio. In the summer of 2015, the Gange Vecchio Archaeological Project, student excavations spent a majority of the time digging through an overburden zone that reached down approximately 40 centimeters across the entirety of the 5 by 5 meter Saggio F unit that you saw on the previous slide. Within this immense plow zone context, which was designated as US 40, an abundance of artifact material dating from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE was recovered. The remarkable collection of artifacts from this context provided strong evidence for identifying the site as a wealthy Roman villa structure, and some of the more spectacular finds in the single context included nearly 80 fragments of bone hairpins, of which you see just a few examples here. Various examples of stamped pottery, like this one here. And some of these stamped pottery, a lot of them show erotic scenes or imagery relating to fertility. And then our first few examples of bronze objects that we would later recognize as most likely medical implements. In the following field seasons of 2017 and 2019, more medical tools, some relating to bone surgery in particular, such as this bone lever that we see right here, were recovered and identified through comparison of medical toolkits retrieved from the Roman site of Pompeii. Of particular interest to this paper, however, was a single lamp fragment from US 40, depicted here, which we believed at the time of discovery depicted an odd erotic scene. This was in keeping with other examples of sexually explicit images that we'd found on other ceramics, and it fit into this overall theme of a wealthy Roman villa. However, upon further reflection and discussion with some of my colleagues, I came to understand and consider this to be a rare depiction of childbirth, the likes of which none of us had ever seen before, and definitely was not heavily represented in any of the scholarship at the time. In my dissertation, I argued that all of these objects together could be indicative of a female medical practice that operated sometime between the 1st and 4th century CE. I continue to be drawn to the possible identity of the female practitioner and what her interactions within her community in rural Roman Sicily may have looked like. At the time, societal ideas of health and medical care were shaped by both rational medicine and belief systems of religion and magic that offered alternative forms of healing. Rational medicine was based on the theoretical explanations of health and illness, defined and expanded upon, particularly in the Hippocratic corpus, which emphasized natural causes for illnesses and the balancing of humors in order to restore health. In contrast, alternative forms of healing considered supernatural causes for illness and the use of sympathetic magic and homeopathic treatments to restore health. By the time this individual at our site was practicing medicine in the 1st to 4th century CE, these two concepts of healthcare had developed some strong gendered associations. So one part of this paper aims to show how the rising popularity of Hippocratic medicine led to disparaging representations of women healers as ugly and dangerous witches in Roman literature. Pauline Ripat's 2016 article, Roman Women, Wise Women, and Witches, has already done an excellent job of demonstrating how literary depictions of Roman witches can provide us with some insight into the ways in which a majority of female healers practiced medicine in ancient Rome. To set up her article, Ripat states, "It is difficult to know how to understand in both ancient sources and modern scholarship women who, in contrast to examples like Aemilia Hilaria, practice medicine like women. Unlike the proponents of named schools of medical philosophies, their practices did not have a literary tradition, but instead belonged to a murky, heterogeneous, and poorly documented folk tradition." She then goes on to analyze negative depictions of female healers in Roman literature to understand how Romans may have perceived and understood homeopathic practices that were commonly used in folk medicine at the time. And while Ripat chooses to focus on the negative depictions of female healers, I wanted to return to this original example of an acceptable Medica that she mentioned, Aemilia Hilaria. Such individuals to me are fascinating because they must negotiate not only between biomedicine, this Hippocratic corpus type of medicine, and folk medicine, but they also have to contend with gendered stereotypes about their person and practice in order to gain legitimacy as a particular type of medical specialist. As such, I will be looking at two positive Roman literary examples of female healers, along with dedications to Roman women specifically identified as Medica, including Ausanias's poem to his maternal aunt. Similar to Ripat, I argue that such analyses of text can help us to reassess artifacts and spaces to understand how they would have operated in the medical pluralistic world of ancient Rome. First, I wish to address why it's worthwhile to look at literary texts rather than medical texts when trying to understand past systems of healing. One reason to do this is that medical texts often present or promote a single view of medicine. Another reason to analyze literary texts is that the medical practices of women rarely made it into ancient medical texts. One likely reason for this is that male Greek doctors were using writing as a means of defining and legitimizing their own type of medical practice, mostly based upon the Hippocratic corpus that had been developed in the 5th and 4th century BCE. This creates a very skewed viewpoint, not only in terms of gender, but also in how the general populace understood health. The reality is that in the past, as is often the case today, healthcare systems are pluralistic. Medical anthropology has been using the term medical pluralism to describe the availability of different approaches, treatments, and institutions that people use to maintain health or treat illness. Scholars studying ancient and medieval medicine around the Mediterranean world have also adopted this concept in their writing. In the opening chapter of Vivian Newton's text, Ancient Medicine, he makes the point healing is better seen as a broad system of interaction between society and individuals over the meaning of health and the way it is to be maintained, regained, and defined. Newton brings up another important point for consideration when he writes, moreover, despite attempts by authors such as Scribonius Largus or Galen to set professional standards, the absence of any legal backing left the decision about who was or was not a doctor, or whom one might consult for a cough or a fistula, firmly with the patient. As a result, claims from medical texts espousing one type of healing practice probably do not reflect the type of care that most people sought. This becomes clear when we look at medieval Islamic medicine. As I will later show, it is worthwhile to look at this period of healthcare as well, because Hippocratic medicine continued to be copied, translated, adopted, and expanded upon in the medieval Islamic world, so as to continue the process of legitimizing the medical profession based on biomedical practices. Even so, other healing practices persisted as well. So, how do we see the gendering of these practices taking place? I argue that it's closely tied to shifting literary representations of witches in Greek and Roman texts. In her book chapter, From Goddess to Hag, Barbara Stanley Spaeth investigates shifting presentations of witches in Greek and Roman texts. Though connection with nature is a common feature in both cultures, Spaeth observes that, in general, Roman witches are represented far more negatively than Greek witches are, applicable particularly to the witch figures invented by the Romans themselves, rather than witches like Circe or Medea, whose portrayals were borrowed from Greek literature. General differences between Greek and Roman witches include their appearance. We go from young and beautiful to old and ugly. The motives of the witches, which in Greek tend to be more neutral or helpful, and in Roman versions, they're selfish and harmful, as well as the methods used. Most of Greek references to witchcraft are tied to simple pharmacology, and then the Romans go into a lot more elaborate and ghastly rituals in their descriptions. So this leads Spaeth to ask, how then can these significant differences in the literary representation of Greek and Roman witches be interpreted? She offers a few possible explanations. One, early Greek portraits of Greek witches come from a period in which the concept of magic was not fully defined, and so its negative characteristics were not yet completely developed. Another possible explanation is that magic in general was viewed more negatively in Roman culture than in Greek. And for those first two explanations, Spaeth recognizes that they don't address the highly problematic representations of gender and magic. While depictions of female witches became increasingly negative over time, Spaeth writes, literary portraits of male practitioners of magic in Latin literature and also in Greek literature from the Empire are in general far more positive than those of female ones. Men are represented as learned magicians or even philosophers, whose interest in magic is part of their research or is part of their own search for knowledge, and they are also portrayed more often as using their magic for good rather than evil. Spaeth's final proposed explanation for these differing portrayals is the possibility that these differences are related to the cultural constructions of the female in Greek and Roman society, in particular in the divergent concepts that these peoples had of the appropriate relationship between women and power and between women and the divine. In Greek society, women's societal power was largely restricted to the religious sphere, while in Roman society, from the late Republic on, women had considerable economic and political power, although this power was unofficial and highly contested, whereas their role in state religion was highly restricted. So while I do agree with many aspects of Spaeth's explanations, I think it fails to take into consideration another factor, which is the arrival of Hippocratic medicine in Rome via Greek doctors. For the first explanation of magic not being clearly defined during the period of early Greek portrayals of witches, we can point to the fact that rational medicine is also not clearly defined at that time as well. Her second point regarding stronger distrust of magic by Romans, Spaeth makes an interesting observation that in the time period from which most of our literary portraits of Roman witches come, which is the late Republic and early Empire, concern over the practice of harmful magic seems to have been quite high. This also happens to be the period of time that corresponds, or at least comes on the heels of, the anti-Hellenistic movement of the 2nd century BCE, and can also be tied to the arrival of Greek doctors in Rome. Finally, to Spaeth's final point of Roman women gaining considerable economic and political power starting in the late Republic, I would add that the medical professional offered a unique opportunity for women of lower statuses, even slaves, to gain economic independence. A clear demonstration of this can be seen in the epigraph dedicated to Scantia Redempta by her parents, which reads that, with Scantia's death, her husband all at once lost his wife, his own personal physician, and his principal source of revenue. As such, I think the negative literary portrayals of witches is, in part, strongly driven by the rising popularity of Hippocratic medicine over time. To legitimize and define their own rational practice, those that prescribed to Hippocratic medicine used various means to oust competing practices. So returning to my point on negative portrayals of magic in Roman texts and its connection to the anti-Hellenism movement of the 2nd century BCE, some of that same language used to describe witches can also be found in Roman critiques of Greek doctors, as seen in these two examples that I have on the screen here, which emphasize the selfish motivations of doctors, or the outright determination to actually cause harm to their patients. The critiques we see from Pliny's comments on the exchange of money for care and the overall lustful greed of doctors. Newton comments on how Greek and Latin satirists would joke about the propensity of doctors to have sex with their female patients and to murder their husbands in order to cover up their affairs. Newton provides further rationale for the initial resistance of Greek doctors in Rome by noting that a much higher proportion of doctors in the Roman West were of slave or ex-slave status. This leads him to conclude that the low legal personal status of medical practitioners in Italy and the Western provinces, and the general perception that medicine was something foreign, cannot have helped the prestige of the art of the medicine there. As a result, there's a fair amount of bias doctors in the Western Roman world needed to overcome. They did so through various methods, including producing medical texts, establishing ethical standards for medical practice, which we know today as the Hippocratic Oath, as an example, and associating themselves with religious institutions. While the Hippocratic corpus was loath to credit illness or health to a supernatural being, it was in the doctor's best interest to be associated with healing cults due to their popularity with the masses. For example, in 293 BCE, after 3 consecutive years of plague in Rome, the Sibylline books were consulted, and they suggested that the epidemic could only be halted by summoning Asclepius from the shrine of Epidavros. As such, the introduction of Asclepius and his cult at Rome was a formal act by the Roman state. The legitimacy of the healing cult in Rome likely bolstered the validity of doctors who associated themselves with the healing god. Surprisingly, the coexistence between Hippocratic medicine and official healing cults reinforced rather than opposed each other, mostly because it operated on the premise that either illness and health was the result of divine will, or a practitioner used natural means to restore health. Both of these ideologies were in agreement that a doctor or priest could not perform actions to make the god heal on their behalf. Those that claimed otherwise were labeled charlatans or worse. As I mentioned, the shared aspect between secular medicine and religious healing is that the practitioners cannot perform actions to compel the gods to heal their patients. That is not the case with magic, however. In her text, Spaeth defines magic as the socially sanctioned use of supernatural powers and tools to control nature and compel both humans and superhuman beings to do one's will. This also ties into the shared quality of Greek and Roman witches, namely their association with nature. Spaeth posits that witches are not merely associated with nature, but that their connection with nature extends to the actual control of natural phenomena, which could arguably be viewed as controlling the gods themselves, which places them in the same category as charlatans. Why then do we see women healers denigrated in Roman literary texts, but not so much in medical texts? Eventually, we do see this in the later medieval period, when male physicians often denounced women working as healers or doctors, of which I have a very strong example here on the slide. This slide provides just an example of such critiques. Translated from Poorman and Savage Smith, they comment that these writings by stating, female practitioners clearly constituted potentially powerful competition for their male counterparts. The reason that we may see outright attacks of female healers in this period may in part be due to the popularity of biobibliographic works that glorified the image of the physician as an extremely learned and wealthy individual. As physicians increasingly wrote about themselves, it was useful to contrast their person and practice directly against their competition without the need for literary witches to act as metaphorical stand-ins. Even so, descriptions of the appearance and methods used by female healers in the medieval period clearly harken back to their Roman precedents of being old and ugly and uneducated, for instance. So this brings me to the second theme of today's paper, which is meant to look at positive Roman literary and epigraphical examples of female healers in order to understand how Roman women would have navigated the gendered ideas and biases of different healing practices to gain the title of Medica specifically. I will be focusing on three main examples to do this, which include Venus and to a certain extent Ipex in Virgil's Aeneid, Agnodice in Hyginus's Fabulae, and Aemilia Hilaria in Ausenius's Parentalia. So first, I want to note a few things about the surgeon Ipex described in this passage from the Aeneid. We see his association with a healing god, in this case, Apollo. The gift he accepts from the god is described as unheroic arts of healing, as opposed to musical ability, prophecy, or archery. This suggests that Ipex has accepted a less prestigious gift in the eyes of Virgil. Ipex is also referred to as old, and he has knowledge of both pharmacology and surgery, as evidenced with his use of both medical tools to treat Aeneas and some other knowledge of herbs. As we continue on in this passage, we can contrast the description of Ipex, which we might consider the idealized practitioner of Hippocratic medicine, to that of Venus, which we have the description here. And Venus is acting to heal her son Aeneas in this moment. There is emphasis here on Venus as a mother with concern for her child's pain. She too has knowledge of herbs, but here we see a stronger connection to the herb dittany in nature. Like that connection is much more drawn of like, how do we learn the functions of this particular herb, for instance? We also see references to ambrosia and panacea, specialized knowledge associated with her status as a goddess. It is interesting to note that it's her cure that proves successful in this moment, but only the audience is aware of the fact that it's Venus's cure that saves Aeneas. It's not what the surgeon does. Venus's role as healer remains unknown to the doctor and his patient, which I think is an excellent metaphor for the presence of female health specialists in the ancient world who don't necessarily get the credit or recognition for the role they have. So another example to look at is the story of Agnodice, as reported in Hyginus's Fabulae. So Agnodice's story begins with the statement that the ancients didn't have obstetricians, and as a result, women, because of modesty, perish. This highlights the fact that the gender of the doctor may have been an important factor in a patient's decision to seek care. Cultural standards of modesty for women paired with the stereotype of doctors acting with lustful greed would make male physicians a less desirable choice. So as we can see here, Agnodike is described as a certain girl, so possibly younger, a virgin who desired to learn medicine. She cut her hair, dressed in male attire, and sought Herophilus for training. This is the point at which we see the adoption of a male appearance in order to gain legitimacy as a doctor. The mention of Herophilus here is also interesting. That is the name of a well-known Greek physician that practiced around 335 to 280 BCE, who was deemed to be one of the earliest anatomists to practice at Alexandria. Herophilus is also credited with writing a text titled Midwifery, which discussed duration and phases of childbirth. His works are no longer available to us, but he was heavily quoted by Galen in the 2nd century CE. Not only does Agnodike take on the appearance of a man, she receives training from a learned male physician. Agnodike's identity as a virgin is also likely to be significant, especially as it relates to perceptions of both male doctors and female witches. Just as Romans viewed doctors as capable of sleeping or killing their patients, literary witches were also portrayed to be driven largely by bodily lust. In fact, the witch's lust is considered so overpowering that it can cause male impotence. As such, the need for female doctors to appear chaste may have been necessary for their success. This could also have some religious connotations, since consecrated maidenhood lends itself to religious legitimacy, as seen with the Vestal Virgins of Rome. In the end, Agnodike's true gender, along with her male medical knowledge, allows her to be more successful than every doctor in Athens. Finally, we arrive to Ausenius's Parentalia. This is actually a real example of a female Roman Medica preserved to us in text. So Aemilia Hilaria shares various aspects with both Venus, but especially Agnodike. While not a mother herself, Ausenius praises her for treating him as her own son, much as Venus cares for her son Aeneas. She practices medicine like a man, a likely reference to her training in Hippocratic medicine, though we do not know from whom she received this training. And Aemilia Hilaria is further described as blithesome, meaning very easygoing, but that she also grew up in the fashion of a boy. Finally, she supposedly remains a virgin throughout her life, making her an ideal candidate for a female Medica, just like her fictional counterpart, Agnodike. Now, this is not the only real example we have of women in the ancient world who claimed the title of Medica. We have quite a few, actually. Overall, when being praised, we see common themes to both literary depictions of female healers and the dedications to real female healers. There is often an emphasis on modesty, either virginity and or the fidelity to a husband. There's emphasis on caretaking of family. Sometimes there's association with divinity, and they're often mentioned having a medical education associated with a man, and often like that education should not surpass the man either. What is interesting to note is that in Rome itself, epigraphs that do not offer clear praise will simply just state the profession of the women, along with her former or even current slave status. No other aspects of her identity is commented upon, and it's my belief that this is deserving of future consideration, of further consideration in the future. What kind of authority did these women have as medical specialists in the Roman world when they were of lower social status, and not just based on their gender? So that's something to contemplate for the future. So again, ancient medical texts provide a limited look at healthcare by both ignoring or disparaging other healing practices as a means of legitimizing Hippocratic medicine and ousting competition. Furthermore, they remove a major component of the ancient healthcare system, the patient. This means that the full spectrum of healing practices that existed in the ancient Rome never made it never made it into text. One way to understand these other healing practices is to explore textual evidence outside of medical treatises, which I've done a little bit today. Doing so can provide insight into these alternative practices as represented in epigraphy and other archaeological remains. Women claiming or being designated with the title of Medica may be some of our best representations of the medical pluralism that existed in this period. Understanding that such individuals may have practiced both Hippocratic medicine through the use of surgical tools and homeopathic medicine through the use of objects depicting fertility, symbols, or childbirth imagery. This can allow us to consider new readings of artifacts that do not, at first glance, appear to fall into either category. Venus is not just a goddess of sexuality and fertility, she is a mother and a healer. Implements used by women for fabric arts and cosmetic application can be just as easily utilized by a doctor for their treatment of patients. In terms of spaces, since association with religious institutions was one means of legitimizing medical practices, it seems likely that physical proximity to such spaces should be taken into consideration when trying to identify where healing was practiced. So that brings me back to this one lamp fragment I mentioned earlier in the presentation. One of the artifacts that I analyzed with this understanding of medical pluralism is the Roman lamp fragment portraying a real childbirth scene. Reading and interpreting a new image is no easy feat. So I adopted Christiane Souverain-Inwood's methodology for reading ancient images with mythological subjects. She explains this methodology as a way to reconstruct the perceptual filters through which ancient images were inscribed and read at the time of their production. And she calls for both an iconographic analysis, which includes the conventions, codifications, and modalities of the signifying system, along with a semantic analysis, which is the knowledge, ideas, assumptions, and mentality that constitute the semantic fields related to, inscribed in, and called up by the signifiers under consideration in the two processes of meaning production, the inscription of meanings in the representations by the artists, and the extraction of meaning, the making sense of the scenes, by the viewers. This can be achieved by independent but correlative investigations of comparative iconographic elements of an image and textual references to those images. Such analyses of ancient images, especially a semantic analysis, are only possible with the availability of primary sources that discuss the subject matter. For a parturition scene lacking a specific reference to myth, this could prove difficult, though such references do exist, mostly in reference to the goddess of childbirth, Lucina. Therefore, I began with an iconographic analysis of the scene by breaking the image down into three main iconographic elements: a squatting naked female figure, the footstools on which her feet are placed, and a swirling cone shape that sits between her legs. So the next step is to identify comparative iconographic elements, ideally dating to the same period and located within the same contact zone of the Roman Empire. Fortunately, Phil Perkins completed much of the groundwork for this survey research in his investigation of a Bucaro ceramic shard from Poggio-Calla, dated to the late Orientalizing period, about the 7th to 6th century BCE. The ceramic fragment he was looking at included what appeared to be a childbirth stamp on the outside face of either a lid or the base of a carinated bowl. Unfortunately, his study revealed that there were very few comparable images produced in Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and Southwest Asia around that particular time period. This led him to conclude that the Etruscan scene from Poggio-Calla was a very rare detailed representation of human fertility. On the other hand, the use of the particular iconographic element of a female crouching figure appears to span millennia in various locations around the ancient Mediterranean, which does make it difficult, if not impossible, to trace a direct origin or inspiration for the image of a birthing woman found on the Poggio-Calla shard and the later molded lamp fragment that I have from Gancio Vecchio. Some of the earliest examples of a crouching human form found in the Mediterranean come from the southwest Cyprus, which we see an example of right here. Although there's no writing available on these cruciform figurines, as they're termed, Budin concludes that the consistent form of the figure, along with its association with women and children in mortuary settings, suggests that they were in some way associated with childbirth. Many of the ancient Mediterranean childbirth images Perkins identifies includes a second iconographic element of birthing stools or bricks, such as the one we see here. Birthing bricks have been attested to in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, but their practical and religious association to childbirth is better documented in the latter. In fact, later first millennium BCE Egypt appears to be one of the few regions where the representation of birth was less restricted than in Greece and later Rome, where chorotrophic imagery or unnatural mythological births were the preferred representation of childbirth and maternity. Examples of ritual birthing bricks have been discovered in mortuary settings, including in New Kingdom royal tombs, which suggests ties to rebirth and afterlife. Yet a similar birthing brick was recovered from a domestic context in Abydos, dating to the 13th dynasty, around 1800 to 1650 BCE. An interesting exception to early Greek representation of childbirth is the so-called Baubo figurines, and amulets that appeared popular in Greece until the Hellenistic period, but then becomes even more popular in later Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, so these two examples here. The squatting position of the figure on the stamped fragment from Ganjavecchio strongly emulates this imagery. Two bronze statuettes, one from the Egyptian temple to Heracles and Heraklion near Alexandria, depict a woman spreading her legs and threatening her womb with a club. Engraved gems of the imperial age use similar iconography to these statuettes. Two gems from Ptolemaic Egypt depict a woman standing with her legs spread or touching her genitals. These gems bear the inscription Omphale and provide the unexpected model of a woman, often pregnant, always combative, mastering her body and warding off malevolent influences from herself. These gems were commonly produced in the Eastern Mediterranean, but have been found throughout the Roman Empire. It is believed Omphale was introduced in Hellenistic cults during the 4th to 3rd century BCE as a female counterpart to the hero Heracles. Her inclusion in Hellenistic cults allowed for a space where concerns relating to female fertility could be a central focus. This reading is supported by one gem that features the inscription included on the previous slide, which translates to "Stay in your place, womb, lest Typhon seize upon you." A similarly functioning Greco-Roman amulet found in Britain, but inscribed with the words, not images, translates to read, "Make with your holy names that Fabia, whom Terentia her mother bore, being in full fitness and health, shall master the unborn child and bring it to birth." R.S.O. Tomlin comments on this particular inscription, noting that in view of the hazards and painful delays of childbirth, the idea that a mother should master the unborn child is understandable. It may be part of the popular belief that in childbirth, the womb was passive and the baby active. In each case, the purpose of these gems and amulets is to control the womb so that it may successfully produce a child. In all, the iconographic evidence strongly indicates the imagery of a crouched figure, especially a female figure, was utilized in amulets and votive objects to promote successful childbirth. It must be acknowledged, however, that much of this iconographic evidence originates from locations mostly on the periphery of the Roman world. At the same time, I note that Sicily's unique position as a central location and multiple transfer point within the Mediterranean likely allowed people to access various iconographic forms from both the periphery and Rome proper. As such, the development of new iconographic forms in Sicily that ultimately function in the same manner in various locations is not out of the realm of possibility. We see this with some of the Ptolemaic gems that included an anatomical model of the uterus, another iconographic element incorporated in votive offering imagery found in other regions of the Roman world. In many cases, dedicating a model of a given part of the human body is well attested in Greece. We have one example here, but anatomical terracotta models are also common dedications throughout Etruria, Latium, and Campania from the 4th to 1st centuries BCE. Such votives are related to requests for healing or are given in thanks to the deity who may have already rendered a curative service to the dedicant. There is one particular anatomical model that likely functions in a different manner, though, the one meant to represent a uterus. Instead of a request or thanks for healing, these models were more likely dedicated in order to promote and protect fertility and reproduction. While a few different models for terracotta uteri exist, most represent an ovoidal organ comprised of a series of rounded horizontal ridges with an elliptical opening as the cervix, like you can see here. Ammerman notes how the ridges are conventionally interpreted as the muscles of the uterus contracting during labor. The patterns seen on the terracotta uteri mimic the style of swaddling seen on various representations of swaddled infants. The correlation of this pattern between the two types of terracotta votives is further emphasized by the fact that these two types of models are commonly found together at sanctuary sites, where a cult to a fertility deity is housed, such as the Italic temple at Paestum. One of the few examples that we have of an actual parturition scene, which includes the figure of a woman and an infant, comes from the Komombo temple dating to the Ptolemaic dynasty. Perkins explains that this image has a long history within Egypt. Indeed, much earlier, to give birth is represented by an Old Kingdom composite hieroglyph depicting a kneeling woman in profile giving birth to the sign Mis, a three-pronged shape that, by the Ptolemaic period, had become an ideogram of the head and arms of an emerging baby, which we can see here. This ideogram differs from the crouching female figure in that it displays the woman in a kneeling birthing position, but this appears consistent with the use of birthing bricks. Returning to the imagery seen on the lamp, the positioning of the female figure's feet on what appears to be small footstools likely is associated with Egyptian birthing bricks or something comparable, such as a birthing chair used by the Greeks and Romans. Surprisingly, the best analogous example of the imagery seen on this lamp does in fact come from Rome, and it's this image right here. The particular scene I'm referring to comes from a series of four marble relief panels that represent various moments in childbirth, with a fifth panel depicting a scene of breastfeeding. One panel depicts a naked woman crouching on a cushioned and draped couch, with her feet positioned on a footstool very similarly in style to the one depicted on the stamped lamp from parcel 19. All five panels share many stylistic features and may represent a narrative sequence of the stages of childbirth. Alas, all the panels are of unknown provenance, and there are doubts regarding the authenticity of these reliefs due to their unusually explicit subject matter and figures. The figures' non-classical poses. Those factors, paired with an absence of authentic ancient parallels, forces Perkins to recommend that the panels be omitted from consideration until more is learned about the original context. Yet the stamped lamp from parcel 19 is from an unquestionable ancient stratigraphic context, and it may be one of many examples yet to be discovered and identified as a childbirth scene, which would force scholars to revisit the issue of authenticity for these intriguing marble panels, at least in regards to the explicit subject matter of the scenes. If nothing else, should the marble panels prove to be counterfeit, we might consider the idea that the themes depicted come from authentic pieces that archaeologists and scholars have failed to recognize and publish. So, putting this all together, in order to understand the function of the lamp with the childbirth scene, it was important to consider the assemblage of artifacts with which it was found, including objects of female adornment, other erotic imagery, and the medical tools that I mentioned previously. Lamps are prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world and serve a duality of purposes. Other lamps with sexually explicit scenes are likely indications of status. John R. Clarke has made the point that these images were not considered pornographic or shameful, but rather Romans usually associated them with luxury, pleasure, and high status. In other instances, lamps can serve as a funerary dedication. This lamp depicting a childbirth scene might serve a similar function to commemorate a former midwife or even honored a woman who died in childbirth. However, in the context of the collection of female adornment objects, one could view this as an attempt to display wealth but not appear gaudy. Ria Berg makes the argument that because wealthy Roman women were expected to be modest, they would incorporate gender-appropriate symbols into their ornamentation to demarcate their wealth and status. Symbols promoting fertility were commonly used in this manner. However, none of these interpretations take into consideration the presence of the medical toolkit. In another work, Berg's analysis of literary sources implies that women, more so than men, performed alternative care for the treatment of illness, which was more highly dependent on magical medical solutions. An appropriate alternative function for this lamp depicting a childbirth scene then may have been comparable to the votive objects and amulets discussed in the previous section. Could this lamp then be meant to promote a successful childbirth? I would argue that this is most likely the case. It also connects back to an important aspect of a midwife's role. Billie Jean Collins looks at early religious roles for women in Hittite culture, for example, and notes that marriage, birth, and death are considered the traditional spheres for women's religion. In the case of the Hittites in Anatolia, we have evidence for several rituals relating to birth, which the midwife was expected to supervise. While making the delivery, the midwife also had a strong magical mythological role to fulfill. Collins explains that the midwife would recite incantations throughout labor and delivery on behalf of the mother and the newborn child. The ancient Greeks and Romans likewise appeared to view midwives as having dual roles of medical specialist and magical practitioner. Thanks to Soranus and his work Gynecology, we have some knowledge about the medical ritual actions midwives were expected to perform after an infant was born. First, the midwife makes a gesture indicating the sex of the child, and then she places the newborn on the earth to examine its condition. According to Veronica Dason's overview of childbirth and infancy in antiquity, this was the moment at which the midwife would determine if the newborn should be accepted and reared by the parents. This moment of inspecting the infant for physical soundness is sometimes represented with mythological or divine models on carved gems dating to the Roman imperial period. In one example, seen on a gem from the British Museum, the central figure standing before the infant holds a spindle and distaff. Dason reads the manipulation of the spindle and distaff as a possible metaphorical reference to the act of cutting the umbilical cord, implying that the midwife is the human doublet of the parcae or morai, like them determining life or death and prospects for the future. Just as the midwife needs certain tools to handle the physical aspects of childbirth, it is reasonable to assume that she also required certain tools to assist with the magical ritual aspects of childbirth, of which our stamped lamp may be an example. Turning to another region of the ancient Mediterranean world, we find examples of how lamps served as important tools in ritual practice. According to Carol Myers, in Iron Age Israel, as well as other parts of the Mediterranean during that time period, shiny objects of any kind were believed to deter evil spirits, which instead favored the dark. Referencing Susan Sared's ethnographic work in Jerusalem, where a Kurdish woman wore silver-threaded amulets made by a female ritual specialist for protection during their pregnancies, Myers notes how the archaeological record for the region finds similar metal items of personal adornment along with clay oil lamps. As such, she concludes that both these flashy adornments and the light provided from the lamps at some point serve to protect the wearer user from malevolent forces. Since reproductive problems could often be attributed to evil spirits or other malevolent forces, many cultures in the Mediterranean resorted to these protective folk customs. Furthermore, the Romans appear to likewise draw a connection between light and successful childbirth in their mythology, more commonly referenced by her Greek name, Aletheia, which means she who comes to aid or relieve. Her Roman counterpart was Lucina, meaning light bringer, and is closely related to the term lucerne, the Latin word for lamp. Both these flashy adornments and the light provided from the lamps serve to protect their wearer user from malevolent forces in a similar manner to the magic gems that I mentioned earlier. Therefore, the parturition lamp of Parcel 19 likely served a dual function. It had the promotion of successful childbirth through a sympathetic representation of that event, and it also acted as a deterrent to any malevolent forces through its function of providing light, possibly by invoking Lucina. At the end of the day, doctors did need to cater to the expectations of their patients who were willing to use any means to prevent illness and restore health. Understanding the plurality of medical practices can help us as archaeologists to recognize the plurality of artifacts and spaces associated for healing. For these images, I want to return to that definition of medical pluralism shared at the beginning of my presentation, which stated that all medical knowledge and practice is inherently plural, ever-changing, and culturally porous. The childbirth imagery seen on this Roman lamp at one point likely functioned as a protective amulet for children, but the pose itself eventually evolved and became the de facto way to depict human anatomy in medical texts by the 10th century CE. To conclude, a careful examination of both positive and negative depictions of female healers is necessary to create a deeper understanding of the medical pluralism that existed in ancient Rome. Furthermore, taking into consideration what choices or actions women could take in order to be successful in the field can help us to better identify objects and spaces associated with healing practices. Overall, answering the question, what makes for an acceptable Roman Medica, may also help us to answer the question, what did patients consider to be an acceptable, effective, successful healing practice? Something that cannot be answered by ancient medical texts alone. And with that is the end of my presentation. Special thanks, as always, to Giovanna Tornabene, of which it's her property that we get to excavate on, as well as the Superintendency of Palermo, who supports the excavation project there. Again, this talk is the result of an invitation from Professor Robert Arnott to speak. And so that was excellent. If you want to hear more about the subject matter, check out podcasts I was a guest on. Let's talk about myths, baby. And you can also follow me on Blue Sky or listen to me on Movies We Dig. That one's not quite as focused on ancient medicine, but we talk a lot about reception, and it's really fun. Thank you for checking this out. I hope you enjoyed it. As any good academic, I have works cited to share with all of you. This takes a lot of work, and it's talking to lots of people all over the world. So I hope you enjoyed that and keep an eye out for more.